John.
Sarah, was it a chain of command issue because Scaramucci said that he had a direct line of communication with the president? There's been some speculation that General Kelly may try to tighten up the number of inputs that the president has. So was it something about the chain of command, or did it have anything to do with that interview that Scaramucci did last?
Look, the president certainly felt that Anthony's comments were inappropriate for a person in that position. And he didn't want to burden General Kelly also with that line of succession, as I think we've made clear a few times over the course of the last couple of days to several of you individually. But General Kelly has the full authority to operate within the White House, and all staff will report to him. When
you say you didn't want to burden him with that line of succession, you mean the chain of command?
Yeah, correct.
And if we could just clarify one point about this chain of command. Apparently Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump have said they look forward to following General Kelly's lead. When it comes to the people who have access to the president, will that conduit be narrowed down now? Will everything flow through Kelly, or will some things still flow around the Chief of Staff's office?
As I just said, the president's given full authority to General Kelly, and he'll make those determinations. April.
Sarah, this statement that was released by the White House says Mr. Scaramucci felt that it was best to give the Chief of Staff, John Kelly, a clean slate and the ability to build his own team. But you just said the president felt that his comments were inappropriate.
I don't see those as being mutually exclusive. I think Anthony wants General Kelly to be able to operate fully with a clean slate, build his own team, while at the same time the president felt his comments were inappropriate. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive.
And a follow-up to that, with the new hierarchy with General Kelly, tell us what it looks like in this administration.
You know, as we've laid out, General Kelly, I think, will bring a new structure to the White House and discipline and strength, and we're all really excited to work with him. And in terms of, I'm not going to draw out an org chart up here, but we'll keep you guys posted. As
Steve Bannon, Kellyanne, everyone reports under him instead of going straight to the president with issues. Does every special assistant go to General Kelly first?
I think I've been clear that General Kelly has the full authority to carry out business as he sees fit.
Does the president regret hiring Anthony Scaramucci?
I'm not going to get into anything beyond what I've already said on that front.
You said you don't want to get into the process, but you already did. The statement says that Scaramucci felt. So you're basically laying this on him. You're saying that it was his decision. Was it his decision?
I think I've been pretty clear that the president felt it was inappropriate. Both Anthony and General Kelly also, I think, came to a mutual agreement, and we're moving forward to focus on the jobs outside of this building, not within it.
So two questions, one on this and then a different topic. Just to clarify, because I want to make sure I understand the word he here, who this refers to. You had said a minute ago he didn't want to burden General Kelly also with that line of succession. The
president.
That's the president. So
yeah.
it's you were saying that it's the president who was deciding that.
Look, we all serve at the pleasure of the president, but I think that this was a mutually agreed conversation that took place between several people.
And then
Stephen,
on the other topic,
oh, sorry, another topic.
Just on Russia and Russia sanctions, do you know whether the president has or intends to soon sign the Russia sanctions bill? And why hasn't the president taken the opportunities he's had today, several public opportunities, to say something in response to Vladimir Putin's retaliation with the 755 diplomats?
Yeah, so we put out a statement over the weekend stating the president's intent to sign, and we'll let you know when that takes place. Again, we'll let you know when that's going to happen. And in terms of your second question, the follow-up was, I'm sorry?
Why hasn't he taken the opportunity to say something forceful to President Putin? I mean, I've talked to folks today who said it's kind of striking, the silence from the president, you know, with no sort of response out of his own mouth. He had a couple of opportunities today to say something about it, and he didn't.
Right now we're reviewing our options, and when we have something to say on it, we'll let you know.
Sorry, not to beat a dead horse, but to go back to April's question.
Why not? That's our favorite thing to do.
You said earlier all staff will report to the new Chief of Staff. Does that include Jared Kushner? Does that include Steve Bannon? Everyone reports to Kelly?
That includes everybody at the White House.
Okay, and then I want to also ask just a question about tax reform. Will the administration absolutely support the version of tax overhaul that comes out of the Ways and Means Committee?
Well, we're working hand in glove with, we put out a joint statement with the Big Six. We'll continue working with them and announce details as they come forward. Francesca?
Thank you, Sarah. When Sean Spicer resigned, it was for a clean slate. Now that Anthony Scaramucci resigned, that's also for a clean slate. Has the slate been totally cleaned at this point? Should we expect any more staff shakeups? Everybody else in senior staff positions is planning to remain for this time?
Yes, they are. John Gizzi?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Two very brief questions. Is there any chance you will just leave the job of communications director alone, having had two people who held it leave rather abruptly in both cases?
We'll let you know when we have any personnel announcements to make on that front.
The other thing I wanted to ask was when the president made his speech to the police officers on Friday, almost within minutes, statements came from police chiefs across the country criticizing his remarks that seemed to endorse the use of force by police in certain arrests. Was the president joking when he said this, or did he check his remarks out with the International Association of Police Chiefs, or maybe the Attorney General?
I believe he was making a joke at the time. Trey?
So to be clear, because the statement says that Anthony Scaramucci is no longer with the administration, was Scaramucci fired by the president, or was he asked to resign?
Again, I'm not going to get into anything beyond what I've already said on that.
Quick follow-up from the president's perspective. You said this was a back-and-forth conversation. Can you take us through a little bit of what the president is looking for in his communications shop, why he might make this decision to make a clean slate?
I think that he wants to work with General Kelly and the communications team that is intact right now and determine what the best course forward is at this point. Noah?
Are reports that Attorney General Sessions is being considered for Homeland Security Chief accurate? How soon will that search be complete? How essential is it for the White House to fill that in a quick manner?
There are no conversations about any cabinet members moving in any capacity, and the president has 100% confidence in all members of his cabinet. Allie?
Two questions for you. One, on the Scaramucci issue, you said the president found his remarks inappropriate. Obviously, the president is not a stranger to salty language. Can you specify what exactly he found inappropriate or disturbing about that?
I said he found it inappropriate for a person in that position.
To do what?
I believe the comments that he made, he found those comments inappropriate. I'm not sure what's unclear.
Okay, as in a betrayal sort of the rest of the staff? Just trying to find out, because you talk about the messaging being important for the president here, and obviously the head of the communications department is crucial to that effort. So just trying to figure out what exactly went wrong between this morning when Scaramucci was here and this afternoon.
Again, I don't think that it's complicated to understand that the president felt the comments were inappropriate. I can't really explain it any further than that. I'm not sure what's hard.
On North Korea, obviously, events over the weekend have unfolded. There's been some discussion from outside analysts who are increasingly speculating about the possibility of a first strike. Is that an option on the table for this White House?
As we've said many times before, the president's not going to broadcast any decisions, but all options are on the table.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. The president week before last signed an executive order on infrastructure. Does that mean that the president has not no intention, but is not going to prioritize working with Congress on an infrastructure bill? Is there any discussion at this point of moving forward on any sort of legislative plans for infrastructure, especially digital, since he mentioned in Iowa?
The president's been very outspoken on the need for a massive overhaul to the country's infrastructure system, and that's certainly still a priority, both legislative and in any capacity that he has the ability to carry that out. Matthew?
Thanks, Sarah. Just kind of big picture here. We've seen the chief of staff, the deputy chief of staff, handful of communications directors, a press secretary, and a national security advisor all leave in the first 6 months of this administration. Can you tell us a little bit about why there's been all this turbulence? I know you don't like to get into the process, but just all those things together, what's going on?
Look, we're continuing to focus on the president's agenda. We're going to have staff changes. We let you guys know when they happen. But like I said earlier, what matters to us are not the jobs that are within this building, but the ones outside of there. That's why the president's been so focused on growing jobs. over 1 million new jobs since he took office, the lowest unemployment in the last 16 years. Consumer confidence is at an all-time high. We're focused on creating a strong economy and growing jobs outside of this building, not focused on the ones within. We're going to continue to do that.
Healthcare,
Alexis?
if I may, a quick follow-up on healthcare.
Sure.
Mick Mulvaney said the White House doesn't want any votes in the Senate until they're voting on healthcare. With John McCain out, Pence out of the country, they don't appear likely to vote on healthcare. And you guys are also pushing for the confirmation of some nominees. Is it the White House position that they will accept the Senate voting on non-healthcare things over the next few weeks and months?
We're continuing to push forward, hopefully, with the repeal and replacement of Obamacare. We've never been shy about that, and we're going to continue to do that. Alexis. Alexis.
The President's Legislative Affairs Director was talking today at the museum about the President's tax reform ambitions, and I wanted to ask if you can elaborate on the President's hope to travel in August to begin to talk about tax cuts and tax reform, and his interest in maybe getting some Democratic senators interested in supporting legislation. Do you have any details that you can supply about where he might go and the message he wants to impart?
Not at this time, but certainly we'll make sure we keep you guys posted on the President's travel and schedule throughout August. I know he does hope to have a large amount of support for tax reform. It's something that is vital to our economy and something certainly the administration is very focused on and has been and will continue working both with the House and Senate as well as members of the administration. We're cutting a little close on time. Thanks so much, guys.
Why was the President joking about police brutality, sir?
On the leaving of Anthony Scaramucci, we have new breaking news tonight about who is behind Donald Trump Jr.'s evolving story about that meeting with a Russian lawyer at Trump Tower. The Washington Post tonight is reporting when the story broke, the story about that meeting that Donald Trump Jr. had with the Russian attorney, the president's advisors talked about how Trump Jr. should respond, and the strategy was to be truthful so the account couldn't be criticized if and when the full details came out. According to the Washington Post, that plan changed because, according to the Post, the president himself personally dictated the statement claiming that the meeting was about the adoption of Russian children. As we know, that statement turned out to be false. As emails released by Trump Jr. showed, released only because that story was about to break, the meeting actually was an offer to give the Trump team damaging information about Hillary Clinton as part of the Russian government effort to help the Trump campaign. Back now with the panel. So, David Chalian, I mean, this is pretty significant. The New York Times had previously reported that Trump advisors were meeting on their way back, I believe it was on Air Force One, to sort of put their heads together to kind of craft a statement, and the president signed off about it. Well, the Washington Post, based on their sourcing, is that the president himself dictated what the response was, and the response, what was so inadequate about it is that it had to be corrected then in subsequent days.
Right. I mean, it's part of what prompted Donald Trump Jr. to release the emails. Remember, he told like 3 different versions of the story, all because the initial response wasn't properly explaining everything that occurred in that meeting. So it raised all these questions. And the difference between signing off on something that's handed to you and something you dictated, inserted yourself in, and directed how this was going to be responded to, that seems to be a pretty significant difference.
I think you put yourself in some legal jeopardy by doing that, because if you really knew what occurred and then you sign off on a statement that is incomplete at best, lawyers can start asking the question, what were you trying to cover up? Why were you, why weren't you completely forthcoming about this meeting? And so to allow the president to do that is a bad decision.
Yeah, Ryan, Liz, there's a quote in this Washington Post article from one of the president's advisors, doesn't say who, saying, quote, "This was unnecessary," said one of the president's advisors, who, like most other people interviewed for the story, spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive internal deliberations. Quote, "Now someone can claim he," meaning the president, "he's the one who attempted to mislead. Somebody can argue the president is saying he doesn't want you to say the whole truth." And in the days after all of this developed, there was, I think, reporting, I think it was from the New York Times, basically saying that Donald Trump Jr.'s attorneys, or maybe it was Pamela Brown, was reporting that Donald Trump Jr.'s attorneys had told her that they wanted initially, they were ready, that Donald Trump Jr. was ready to come with a much more forthcoming statement in that initial statement, but that is not what ended up happening. They didn't point the finger at the president or his advisors, but that seems to be now the implication.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like this is the same issue we've been discussing in the earlier part of the show, is you have a staff at the White House that doesn't always actually have the president's interest in mind. In other words, any other White House, the first thing that they would do if a situation like this came up is basically insulate the president from it, right? In this White House, you have the president micromanaging the place, literally dictating the statement, and as Gloria pointed out, now perhaps opening himself up to legal jeopardy. A professional White House staff, whether this is, ethically dubious or not, and I don't think it is, would keep the president out of any kind of legal jeopardy like that. But as we've seen, the staff doesn't really, they're not able to do that, partly because Trump doesn't want them to. Again, he's running things the way he ran the Trump organization, which is, reaching down into whatever issue he wants and micromanaging it. Up until this point, Trump has basically been his own chief of staff. So I think that, the staff problems we're talking about are related to what's going on here.
I mean, Jeffrey, it's one thing for Donald Trump as a civilian to use a fake name and call up gossip reporters pretending to be a spokesperson for Donald Trump. Right. And giving stories about women he's dating and stuff and puffing him up. It's one thing for him to do that as a civilian. It's another thing for, as President of the United States, to, if this is true, according to the president's advisor here who spoke to the Post, to actually dictate a misleading statement for his son and his attorneys to give out. That's just not a wise, I mean, to Ryan's point, shouldn't the president's people protect him from that?
Well, number one, the president's people should protect the president, any president. Number two, the very fact that this is being leaked by some anonymous advisor goes to General Kelly's problem exactly. I mean, this is one of the things that he has got to put a stop to, because who knows whether this is accurate or not, and who knows who's talking. But certainly this is part of the problem.
With all due respect to this whole conversation about leaking, I mean, we're talking about the people who are leaking the information, but nobody criticizes the person from which that information was created. I mean, it's a calamity of errors. I mean, Donald Trump's legal team is failing him. Donald Trump's staff is failing him. Why on earth would you dictate a statement, not coordinate what you're going to dictate with your son's attorneys and your son, so that you know that when they put out the emails, at least what they put out matches your statement?
We should point out that Donald Trump's legal team previously had denied that the president or his staff had anything to do with the initial statement by Donald Trump Jr.
Right.
They had said that it was Donald Trump Jr.'s with his attorneys.
And don't forget who was on this plane, Anderson. Jared Kushner was on the plane. Ivanka, I believe, was on the plane. So, this notion that the president dictated is interesting to me, because it sounds like a group, it sounds like a group effort, people huddling in the plane and figuring out, okay, what are we going to do with this problem? And don't forget, the president's lawyer, who was his lawyer at the time, Mark Kasowitz, was not on this flight, and he might have advised the president to stay away from it.
And it wasn't just on the plane. According to the Washington Post, it was on the article starts out by saying, on the sidelines at the Group of 20 summit in Germany last month, President Trump's advisors discussed how to respond to new revelation about this
And it
meeting.
says they had the right instincts, I would say. The staff had if bearing that reporting out, if that's true, had the right instincts, which is, let's put everything out so nothing is contradicted in a subsequent...
Which is Public Relations 101.
Exactly, of course, Public Relations 101, and that they report that it was Donald Trump that completely flipped that on its head. So I don't know how much we can blame staff.
But it highlights General Kelly's problem. Because you have all of these people, all of these proverbial cooks that are in the kitchen. I mean, it's hard to kind of make sure that your staff is in order when you have people like Jared Kushner or Ivanka or whomever else able to circumvent that and get the president's ear and say something that apparently is contradictory.
Jared and Ivanka are not going to be leaking to the Washington Post, I assure you.
Well, Jared, wait, what? Really?
Something like this?
I mean, I don't know for a fact, but there's a lot of stories that suddenly always appear that Jared and Ivanka is trying to save the president from himself. And I don't know of anybody else who would be leaking those other than...
I do not believe...
Usually when there's a story out, you can sort of see who does this story benefit, and then you kind of work backward who may have leaked
or who does
I don't know that they're leakers.
Or who does the story trash? And if you're telling me that you think Ivanka and Jared would be trashing their father and father-in-law respectively, I simply don't believe it.
Yeah, I have no idea, but I mean, somebody, you know,
the leaking is not the leaking is the problem is not the leaking. The problem is the president of the United States. Like, it's all cool to get caught up in the leaking and no one should say this and no one should say that. That happens in every single White House. The problem, though, is the behavior of senior leadership and the behavior of the president. If you're dictating a statement that you know is false, there are moral issues. There are
if you want your
issues,
doctor, you can keep your doctor.
Well. Let me tell you something. Is that illegal?
It's not
illegal?
True. It's not true. It was used
illegal?
to pass major legislation.
Is that illegal?
It's not true.
Right.
It was a lie, a deliberate lie.
You go back to this all the time. If you want your doctor, you can keep your doctor. And
because it was a lie.
In certain circumstances, that actually bear it out to have some validity. You know what's not true? You know what's not true, what we know to be false? The fact that this meeting that Donald Trump Jr. had with Paul Manafort and other senior leaders was not about Russian adoption. The only person who truly believes that, I guess, is Donald Trump.
Well, and the special counsel is going to get to the bottom of it. That's what we know. Because now that this story's here,
by the way, this idea that it was about adoption is something that Donald Trump, that President Trump, repeated later on at an open press conference as being, and it was something also that Sean Spicer then repeated, that there's no evidence or no indication.
After the email was already
it was
out.
anything but a meeting about adoption. Anyway, we got to take a break. We'll have more on this breaking story from the Washington Post and others when we come back. Following the story that just broke tonight from the Washington Post, saying that the president himself dictated Donald Trump Jr.'s misleading statement about that meeting with a Russian lawyer at Trump Tower. This was the initial statement that came out from Donald Trump Jr. The Washington Post says the initial strategy from the president's advisors, was to tell the truth, to be very forthcoming. Instead, according to the Washington Post, the president reportedly intervened and dictated the statement himself, claiming the meeting was about Russian adoption. Back with the panel, joining us on the phone also is CNN senior legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin. Jeffrey, just from a legal standpoint, is there anything that should concern the president about this story?
Absolutely. You know, it's been clear for some time that the Mueller investigation is looking at the issue of obstruction of justice. And if, in fact, the president put out a intentionally false story about his relationship with Russia, you know, broadly defined in terms of his son's activity, that would be a piece of evidence that could support a charge of obstruction of justice. That alone is not enough to make a case. But if you were to combine it with firing James Comey and you know, the other parts of the investigation, it certainly would be a relevant piece of evidence. As I say, it's not enough on its own. It's certainly not a crime on its own, but it is evidence that will be of great interest to Robert Mueller.
Jeff, I want to pursue that with you more, but right now on the phone is the Washington Post, one of the reporters who broke the story for the Washington Post, reporter Tom Hamburger. So, Jeff, you could stick around. We'll talk to you right as soon as we're done with Tom. Tom, thanks very much for joining us. If you could just explain what you have learned, what the report in the Washington Post says tonight.
Anderson, what we learned is that the president played a deeper and more complete role than we'd understood previously in crafting the response that was issued, the initial response that was issued after the New York Times reported on that June 9th meeting in Trump Tower, where Donald Trump Jr. Basically organized a meeting that included Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort and some others that we later learned had been set up at the request by an email of the someone connected possibly to the Russian government. The first explanation, you'll recall, was that the meeting was largely about adoption, an initial statement considered quite misleading. And what we're reporting tonight in the Washington Post is that that initial response was effectively dictated by the president over the objection or over warnings of some of his advisors.
Which is really remarkable, because in your report it says basically on the sidelines of the Group of 20 summit in Germany, the president's advisors were wrestling with what kind of a statement to draft, and that, according to your reporting, they actually wanted to be pretty forthcoming.
That's what we learned from talking with multiple people involved in the process. In the early going, there were suggestions from lawyers and some others who were close to the president that a more what they describe as a more fulsome statement would be appropriate, partly thinking because some had seen these documents, the emails already, thinking that being transparent, more transparent at the outset, would avoid embarrassment later.
Which it was actually the correct decision to make. It would have avoided the president's son having to reissue statements and then release finally the emails once they were about to be released by the New York Times. So the president himself, do you know the scene of how it was? Was it on Air Force One? And to what extent, when you say the president dictated the statement, how does that actually work? Like, he literally, word for word, he sort of had somebody write down his remarks as what the statement should be?
Well, so the phrase "dictate" is one that my colleagues Phil Rucker and Ashley Parker, who, as you know, cover the White House full time, have picked up from their sources. What we understand is that this was really a decision led by the president, and that the statement that was ultimately issued is one that he decided, and is often his way. As you know, he's not an emailer. He suggested the language in the statement that was ultimately used and ultimately released to the New York Times, and to a certain extent had to be walked back or amplified upon in the coming days.
It's interesting. I mean, it's not clear to me. You know, the president's attorneys, I believe, had previously said that it was Donald Trump Jr. and Donald Trump Jr.'s attorneys who had been the ones crafting this statement, that the president had nothing to do with it, and that they denied the initial New York Times story, which said that on Air Force One, this had been discussed amongst his advisors and the president had signed off on it. So the idea that the president was even more involved in that, that's something that runs counter to what the president's own attorneys have said. Did you get any responses from the president's attorneys about the discrepancy between your reporting and what their past statements were?
We did. You know, we sent quite a lengthy list of, long list of questions to Jay Sekulow, who, as you know, is one of the president's attorneys and is perhaps the most outspoken. And he didn't answer our specific questions, but did issue one sentence to us, which reads, Anderson, the president's attorney said, "Apart from being of no consequence, the characterizations are misinformed, inaccurate, and not pertinent." We went back and asked again for specifics, but it didn't receive anything, any guidance beyond that statement that I just read.
It's also, I mean, I guess the other question is, when did the president, at the time that the president was crafting this statement or dictating this statement, did he actually know what the real reason for the meeting was? Had he had a conversation with Donald Trump Jr.? Had Donald Trump Jr. been forthcoming? Or did the president know from way back? You know, Donald Trump Jr. has said that the president, he never said anything to the president about this. At that time, the president or the candidate, he never told his father about this meeting or the purpose of the meeting, or that he had learned that Russia, according to the email from Goldstone, that Russia was backing his father's campaign. The president, Donald Trump, was unaware of that, according to Donald Trump Jr. But it sounds like, I guess the question is, did Donald Trump know about the meeting, the real reason for the meeting, when he was helping craft the statement?
So, Anderson, that's of course a key question, and it's not one that we can answer with confidence. As you point out, the president and Donald Trump Jr. have indicated that the president was not fully informed. What our story tonight points out is that the question of how to respond to this report that was coming in the New York Times last July was discussed on the sidelines of the G20 by top presidential aides and advisors. And as you recall, Jared Kushner and his wife Ivanka Trump were at the G20.
Right.
So there were discussions about how to respond on the sidelines. And what we hear from our sources is that the initial discussion was one of recommending openness and a full response, knowing that these emails, that there were documents in a sense that lurked in the background that would tell a potentially more troublesome story. The conversation then moves on to Air Force One as the president and his party depart from Hamburg, Germany, the site of the G20, and the discussion continues. And then from Air Force One, a decision is made that a much more limited statement about this meeting will occur, one that discusses it as really a brief and not consequential discussion about adoptions of Russian children in the United States. was issued, and that's issued in the afternoon that Saturday. And what we learned from our sources is that that statement was dictated from the president, and the story, the statement itself, goes to the New York Times and then is published that afternoon while Air Force One is still in the air on the way back to Andrews Air Force Base.
Yeah. It's a fascinating and eye-opening report. It's in the Washington Post right now. Tom Hamburger, I appreciate you being with us. Thank you very much. Up next, we're going to have more on this. New also reporting, CNN reporting on now Chief of Staff John Kelly and what he did when President Trump fired then FBI Director James Comey. Information tonight about now Chief of Staff John Kelly's reaction when President Trump fired then FBI Director James Comey. CNN's Pamela Brown joins us with those details. Pam, what have you learned?
Well, Anderson, we've learned that incoming White House Chief of Staff John Kelly was so upset with the way President Donald Trump handled the firing of FBI Director James Comey that he actually called Comey shortly after he was terminated to say how angry he was, to express that to him over the phone. This is according to two law enforcement sources familiar with the conversation between Kelly and Comey. And at the time, Anderson, this was this past May, as you'll recall, Kelly was Secretary of Homeland Security, and the sources say that he was particularly upset by the way Comey was treated, how it all went down, by the fact that he learned that he had been fired on the news rather than being told or informed by the president. Now, the call took place while Comey was traveling back from Los Angeles to Washington on May 9th, as I pointed out, after learning the news. Comey declined to comment to us about the story. The White House and DHS did not comment either, Anderson.
I also understand that General Kelly was actually prepared to resign over it?
We were told through our sources that something he contemplated, and he expressed this over the phone. He was so angry that he considered or contemplated resigning from his position as Secretary of Homeland Security in a showing of solidarity with Comey. Now, we're told that Comey responded telling him not to resign, not to do anything. And both sources we spoke with cautioned that it was unclear how serious Kelly really was about resigning. And of course, as we know, that never happened. And fast forward a few months later, now he's White House Chief of Staff. But for context here, Anderson, the sources said that Comey and Kelly are not particularly close friends, but they had a professional relationship and a deep mutual respect for each other. And in this case, Kelly was just simply upset and, as one source put it, disgusted about the way Comey had been treated by the president. Anderson.
All right, fascinating details. Pamela Brown, thanks very much. Joining me now for more on the handling of Comey's resignation, the breaking Washington Post reporting, is CNN National Security Analyst General Michael Hayden, former director of both the CIA and the NSA. General Hayden, thanks for being with us. Sure. A lot to ask you about. First of all, your reaction to this reporting that General Kelly was upset about the way that Director Comey was fired.
Yeah, I know John Kelly. That sounds exactly how I would think John Kelly would respond to this. Now, I don't know any of the fine print. I'm learning about this the same way you are, Anderson, but it's very consistent with the character of the man that I know.
The reporting tonight from the Washington Post that was just breaking that President Trump actually dictated John Jr.'s misleading statement on his meeting with a Russian lawyer. I'm wondering if true, and again, this is not CNN reporting, this is Washington Post reporting based on what they say are multiple sources, how damning is it for the president? Because this is certainly something that Special Counsel Bob Mueller would be looking into.
Well, sure, and I'll leave your legal experts to go ahead and comment on what that might mean to former Director Mueller's investigation. But Anderson, I was watching the breaking news in the green room here, and the thought occurred to me, when I was a military attaché in a communist country during the Warsaw Pact, the People's Republic of Bulgaria, I got into a long discussion with one of my Bulgarian counterparts, and he was saying things that so frustrated me that I actually said to him, "What is truth to you?" And he looked me right in the eye and said, "Truth? Truth is what serves the party." Now, look, I know we're imperfect. Sometimes we stray into gray areas in our political system, but I think most people like me, Anderson, think a statement like that, "Truth is what serves the party," belongs to that system, not to our system. And so the news that you reported, if true, is very disturbing.
I want to ask you about relations with Russia. President Trump expected to sign the sanctions bill approved by Congress, hasn't signed it yet. In retaliation, Vladimir Putin ordered the U.S. to cut 755 diplomatic staff in Russia, which is the most aggressive move against Washington since the final years of the Cold War, if I'm not mistaken. How significant is this?
I think it's a big deal, but it leaves an awful lot of questions unanswered, Anderson. So number one, Putin decides to go ahead and respond. And by the way,
that response, some sort of response, should have already been baked in to the Obama administration's decision to go with sanctions in the first place, and the Congress's decision to go with sanctions. But I found it interesting that Putin decided to move after Congress had acted, but before Trump had acted, before the president had signed the sanctions bill, in a way perhaps not setting up a direct confrontation between President Putin and President Trump. I found that a very interesting step.
So that's interesting, in a way, sort of giving some wiggle room?
I think so. It allows him to come. Look, if he waited until after President Trump signed the bill, and by the way, Anderson, let me give you an interesting question here. What will President Trump's signing statement look like when it comes to signing these sanctions? Now, I think President Putin deflected that question by going ahead and acting before that took place. And Anderson, let me give you just one additional thought. I don't know within what strategic context this is all happening from the point of view of the United States. You know what I would love to see is someone in authority, the president, the vice president, whomever from the White House, to simply say the Russian-American relationship will be governed by the following 3, 4, 2 principles. I don't know what those are.
Which is kind of a frightening thought, or I mean, the fact that you don't know what they are is not clear.
If I look at the specific actions, Anderson, I try to create parallax to get them to come back to a common point, and I don't have that yet.
Wow. General Hayden, appreciate you being on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Up next, back to the fall of Anthony Scaramucci, forced out as White House Communications Director after just 11 days in the West Wing. Well, it was a short tenure. He leaves us with some memorable moments. We'll show you those ahead and more in the breaking news that we've just learned about President Trump and that early statement from Donald Trump Jr. Well, we've got a lot of breaking news tonight, but one of the big ones is, of course, Anthony Scaramucci out as White House Communications Director, officially on the job for 5 days, the shortest tenure for anyone in that role, according to CNN's count. But he was in the West Wing for a total of 11 days, 11 very memorable days. Here's Randy Kay.
The Navy SEALs would tell you that if you want to eat an elephant, you got to eat it one bite at a time.
It was bizarre from the beginning, with a hint of what was to come.
There's been some speculation in the press about me and Reince, so I just want to talk about that very quickly.
From day one, Anthony Scaramucci addressing what was about to become a very public battle between him and then White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus.
Reince and I have been personal friends for 6 years. We are a little bit like brothers, where we rough each other up once in a while, which is totally normal for brothers.
By the fourth day, Scaramucci was making changes, allowing cameras back into the press briefings, announcing it with this tweet that read simply, "TV cameras are back on." Then things got, well, weird. After the New Yorker's Ryan Lizza broke the news last week that Scaramucci and others were dining at the White House with the President and First Lady, the newly installed communications director unleashed a profanity-laced rant at Lizza about some of the president's key advisors. On Reince Priebus, Reince is a blank paranoid schizophrenic, a paranoiac. On White House Chief Strategist Steve Bannon, I'm not Steve Bannon. I'm not trying to suck my own blank. Scaramucci also suggested that Priebus was leaking confidential White House information, which Priebus later denied to CNN. Scaramucci finally telling Lizza he had to go so he could start tweeting some blank to make this guy crazy, meaning Priebus. The vulgar tirade made headlines everywhere. On Thursday, Scaramucci's 7th day on the job, he was trying to turn the page on CNN's New Day, telling Ryan Lizza he was just teasing him on the phone.
I want to reset at zero. I just spent about 15 minutes on the phone talking with the President of the United States, who has given me his full support and his full blessing.
Scaramucci still trying to play tough with the leakers.
As you know from the Italian expression, the fish stinks from the head down. But I can tell you 2 fish that don't stink, okay? And that's me and the President. So if Reince wants to explain that he's not a leaker, let him do that.
The very next day, on Friday, Priebus was out of a job. It was also the day the New York Post reported Scaramucci's wife had recently filed for divorce, something her lawyer confirmed to the New York Times. Scaramucci then kept a low profile over the weekend, Seemingly unaware he was on the chopping block, on day 11, Scaramucci showed up for work. He even attended this morning's swearing in of the new chief of staff, the same chief of staff demanding his ouster. Randy Kay, CNN, New York.
In a moment, we'll have the latest from the White House on how Scaramucci's removal as communications director actually happened today, who called for it, and who told him about it. Also, the breaking news from the Washington Post. It's reporting that the president himself dictated Donald Trump Jr.'s misleading statement about that meeting with a Russian lawyer at Trump Tower. Well, another chaotic day at the White House. Breaking news on two fronts tonight. Anthony Scaramucci, of course, out as White House communications director. We'll get to that this hour, but we begin with another potential bombshell in the Russia White House watch, a report about who actually was behind Donald Trump Jr.'s misleading statement, the initial statement about that meeting with a Russian lawyer at Trump Tower. Turns out, according to the Washington Post, it was the president. The Washington Post is reporting when the story of the meeting broke, the president's advisors wanted to tell the truth about the meeting in case the full details came out. The president seems wanting to go in another direction. According to the Washington Post, the president personally dictated the statement, claiming that the meeting was about the adoption of Russian children. That statement turned out to be false because his emails eventually released by Donald Trump Jr. showed emails he had to release because the New York Times had them. The meeting actually was an offer to give the Trump team damaging information about Hillary Clinton as part of the Russian government effort to help the Trump campaign. Jeff Zeleny joins us now from the White House. Pretty fascinating, Jeff. I mean, you were actually on this trip back from Europe, where, according to the Washington Post, this all took place. What more can you tell us?
I was, Anderson. I was on Air Force One that day as the pool reporter flying back from Hamburg, Germany, where the G20 summit had just happened. And remember, the news in that time was the president had just had his first face-to-face meeting with Vladimir Putin. So that was on the top of mind. But as we later learned, there was also a lot of discussion happening on the flight about this statement. The New York Times was going to report some details of that meeting that we've all been talking so much more about now, that July 2016 meeting at Trump Tower. And the reality here is that CNN reported a couple weeks ago that the White House aides and others involved in that discussion about crafting that statement may be subjected to legal jeopardy here because they were discussing in real time what was going on about that Russian meeting. But this is the first we're learning from this Washington Post report that the president dictated this. But it has a ring of the president trying potentially to protect some other, perhaps members of his family or others, because just the confines of Air Force One, Anderson, it's pretty hard to believe that the president would be dictating this without his son-in-law or his daughter or anyone knowing about this. I mean, they essentially are flying together on this here. So that's the question I have tonight. If the president was dictating this statement, if that's true, as the Washington Post is reporting, who else was listening to that or involved in that? Because, again, on a plane for, probably 8 or so hours that day, we landed back at Joint Base Andrews at about 8 or so in the evening. So interesting now we're learning the president may have dictated that, Anderson. Certainly just one more example that everything seems to go back to Russia and the investigation.
Yeah, and, I mean, Jeff, what's interesting about this is that the president's attorneys have subsequently come out and said, look, the president didn't have anything to do with this. The advisors, that initial statement, which was misleading, was crafted by Donald Trump Jr. and his attorneys. Donald Trump Jr. Or attorneys for Donald Trump Jr. had told Pamela Brown that, in fact, they were ready and wanted to put out a more fulsome statement, I believe was their terminology, if memory serves me correct. But that's not what ended up happening. Jeff, thanks very much. I want to play for you what two people close to the president said about this at the time. It's Trump attorney Jay Sekulow and then Sarah Huckabee Sanders at one of the audio-only briefings. Let's play this.
So he didn't have anything to do with the statement that Don Jr. put out that was being worked on with his team?
That was the statement that Don Jr. put out. Are you talking about yesterday's, Chris?
The one over the weekend that the president's team was helping with.
That was written. No, that was written.
New